There are three different ways that crankshafts are held into main bearings, and if you're doing a bottom end, you need to understand the difference. If a crank spins inside the bearing, there's going to be a whole bunch of heat that builds up in here, and essentially what it's going to do is weld the bearing to the crank and cause the bearing to fail. The first one is an interference fit between the crank and the bearing. What that means is that the crank is actually a little bit bigger than the bearing, and it has to be either pulled in or the bearing has to be heated up enough that the crank can slide through, and then as it cools, it clamps onto the crankshaft. The second way to achieve this is to clamp the bearing between the crankshaft and a collar. Basically, you'll have a big washer on this end of the crank and either a nut or a bolt over here, and the bearing is sandwiched between the crank here, the collar, and this bolt or nut. The third way is to use a roller bearing instead of a ball bearing. With a roller bearing, you put the inner race of the bearing onto the crankshaft first, generally with heat. The outer race of the bearing stays in the crankcase. The inner race just slides into the rest of the bearing, and there's a lot of forgiveness for where the crank ends up in relation to that bearing.